ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلله فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله صلى الله عليه وسلم. All praise is due to Allah, from whom we seek our help and forgiveness. We seek refuge with Allah from the evil of our own souls and from our own bad deeds. Whomsoever Allah guides will never be led astray, and whomsoever Allah leads astray, no one can guide. I bear witness that there is no God but Allah, the one who has no partner. And I bear witness that the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings of Allah be on him, is Allah's servant and messenger. Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu ittaqullaha haqqa tuqatihi wa la tamutunna illa wa antum muslimun. O ye who believe, be mindful of Allah. Be mindful of Allah in the way that Allah deserves, and do not die except in a state of full submission to Allah. Subhanaka la ilma lana illa ma 'allamtana innaka antal alimul hakim. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. Again, assalamu alaikum, brothers and sisters. It's a pleasure to be here with you all again. I was actually usually on Fridays, I go to the local prison here and do the Jummah there. So I haven't been able to participate with you all in a live setting here. And so it's a privilege to be able to be back. But also, it reminds me as well that whenever I go to these different spaces, there's lessons that I am able to glean, and most likely so many of us can take away that oftentimes we're not privy to, and we aren't, because that's a place in society that is literally behind bars. And so I'm hoping today's reflection though it was crafted for people who are, in a sense, behind bars, in a sense, I hope that this can speak to us wherever we may be, regardless of our differences, because in reality, we all do live in various different kinds of prisons of our own construction, of our own minds, of our own settings. Wherever we may be, we may sometimes have to navigate ourselves through these different bars we find ourselves lagged behind by. And so today, when I was coming for this Jummah, I stopped on the way to the post office, and I usually correspond with some of the inmates that are at the facilities that we work with, and one of them sent a letter, and he and I have been touching base, and he was giving me his Ramadan reflections, and I know I've shared some of those Ramadan reflections with you all, but this brother had shared some of the struggles that are very real for him, and what has kind of been going through his mind, and what has been kind of under his circumstances right now, that they haven't been able to do Jummah at his facility that he's at. They haven't really been able to accommodate for many things, his labor and whatnot that had to go on during Ramadan, kind of really pushing him to the edge, and still that desire to want to fast, that desire to stay connected to the faith. And stories like this really, I think, help speak to each of us, because some of us were born into the faith, some of us have it fairly comfortably, and so we don't really have to struggle for the faith as it may have come about when it first originated. And so it's just a reminder for us that the message of this, the struggle of this, is something we can all relate to. And so when I was talking about this khutbah, when I was putting this together, I had the example of Malcolm X in mind. Malcolm X's story is one that many people, if not most people, are familiar with. You may, if you haven't heard of Malcolm X, you may have, just come across in various media or movies or different things. But the story of Malcolm X is fairly familiar for a lot of folks. And if you haven't had the chance to read the autobiography of Malcolm X, or even just watch a documentary about Malcolm X, or any of the media that's out there, I'd really encourage that, because there's lessons from not just Malcolm X, but from people who are very much like him, who are going through his struggle, who live his life story up to a certain point, who can serve as examples for us, who we can learn so much from, regardless of who we are or where we might be. With respect to Malcolm X, though, theologian James Cone writes that Malcolm X's faith in the setting of just him having faith. His faith was something that was marginal, not only in America as a whole, but in the African American community itself. It's the idea that a person from the Black underclass, someone who's a hardened criminal with no university or any graduate or seminary education, that this person was someone who could teach people in America about their God, and how it's unthinkable to see that the vast majority of whites and blacks could learn from a former convict and dope pusher, and how that person taught them things about the divine, taught them things about the religion, taught their things about what's holy, that this wasn't someone who's given a traditional training. This was not someone who spent time in a seminary. This wasn't somebody that grew up in a kind of family that was getting them ready for a calling to ministry or anything like that. This was a person who had a very strong change of heart and change of conviction, and came out a very different person than they were when they went in, and became someone who people up until this day try to learn from, try to see, and people follow in the footsteps of. And so what can be gleaned from us for each of us is how our faith can find the example, can find that light, can find that relatability in people that are in the non-traditional sense, in people who are in the margins. So sometimes we may just think that our faith and whatnot is only built upon those people who are religiously trained, who are the imams, the scholars, the sheikhs, the sheikhs, whatever they may be. All of these people are only the keepers of knowledge, and we can only learn from these folks. And what Malcolm X's story teaches us is that that's not the case at all, that you have these examples and people living, walking, breathing right next to you all over the place, who, if we just give them the time of day, if we give them even the opportunity and the circumstance, they have the opportunity to not just change our world, but change the world completely around, outside of the immediate community. And so Malcolm X's example here, as we stick to his story, Malcolm X's awakening to Allah, to awakening to God, it didn't begin with a conscious search for God. It didn't begin with this aspect that, oh, like now I need to go find God, I'm in this space. It began with the desire to escape. When he was incarcerated, that he needs to get out. How do I get out? And for him, methodically speaking, the education was the way to go. Not just education, but being able to educate himself from how to get to the mindset of those who are not, or who are held down. So, Malcolm X was someone who was imprisoned for robbery and theft, and he found himself literally in the lowest of the lows, in the darkest of the lowest depths. He was someone who was not just seen as a person of faith or someone who didn't have faith when he came into jail. He himself described how he was against it. He said in his autobiography that I considered myself beyond atheism, or the belief that there is no God. I considered myself that I was Satan. So thinking about that, Malcolm X was someone who at one point in his life, given all that he had gone through, at the point where his compass was about to change, at the point that he's about to turn and embark on a completely new journey, the first part of that turning was literally him acknowledging that I'm on the exact 180-degree opposite of where I need to go here. I am literally, I feel that I am Satan, like I am anti-faith in that aspect. And so this was where Malcolm X was. This was where someone who was a hustler, someone who was tempted, was whispered to, who had lied, who rebelled, who defied, any authority, all at that point, was in that space. And until at last that life had caught up to him, that finally, as he was living in this life that he was lost on this path, he was finally caught up to. But as he describes, I was just deaf, dumb, and blind. That it was in this most feeble and powerless state that Malcolm X realized that he was like, I'm Satan. Like I'm antithetical to what I want to be, or what I believe myself to be. And so Malcolm X had given the devil quarter within. He had given the devil refuge within, but Malcolm himself had been cast out. So when he was living this lifestyle, his own personal kind of his own person in himself, his own nafs, his own true self was cast out and put in the corner and condemned. And this new kind of embodiment of Satan was essentially there. But it was in this dark corner that Malcolm X had been pushed to, but had been relegated to, and literal dark corner, surrounded by the concrete walls of prison, where Malcolm X began to turn. Malcolm X began to not just study religion, he began to study language. He worked on his penmanship. He knew that his knowledge lay in his empowerment. His efforts culminated in copying word for word and studying the English dictionary. And it's through these labors that you see how Malcolm X achieved the kind of mastery that we'll talk about in a second, that through the words, through the mastery of the word, Malcolm X would attain not just faith, not just the faith that would later define his life, but also the freedom that came with it. Again, not just the literal freedom, but of removing oneself from prison, but the mental freedom as well, of being able to be freed of what society has chained us with. And so you have, as Malcolm X is progressing, his brother, who became a Muslim, writes to him that, hey, don't eat any more pork, don't smoke any cigarettes, that we'll show you how to get out of prison. At the time, his brother was a member of the Nation of Islam, and told him, I'll show you how to get out of prison, but don't eat any more pork, don't smoke any cigarettes. Anybody who's in prison will say that that's not going to get anybody out of prison. But his brother also talking about what is the prison that Malcolm is living into, knowing that Malcolm was someone who was pushing drugs, who was robbing, who was doing all this stuff, that how do we get him out, not just of the literal prison, but of the prison of his mind. And later on, Malcolm X says that as he was reflecting on this, that later on I would learn that when I read and studied Islam a good deal, that unconsciously my first pre-Islamic submission had manifested. I had experienced for the first time the Muslim teaching that if you take one step toward Allah, Allah will take 10 steps towards you. That in the one aspect, even if it's conscious or unconscious, you move towards Allah, Allah opens doors for you. So he starts to learn his penmanship, gets the letter here, that I'll show you how to open prison, that you're opening a book, I'll show you how to open the doors of a prison. And so these letters taught Malcolm X more about Islam. The key to a Muslim is submission, not just one in the physical manifestation, but in the submission of oneself, and attuning oneself towards Allah. And what can we draw from this so far? One, that in the sense that don't take for granted any of the small tasks that you do. It doesn't have to be that your faith life is one thing, your religious life is another thing. For our purposes and for Muslims' purposes, these are all abound. These are all interconnected, that when you make a step in this life, it doesn't have to be disconnected from your religious life. If you're doing successfully in your business or in your education or whatnot, that doesn't have to be disconnected from your faith or your religion. That these are things intertwined, but at the end of the day, what is the foundational stone that they're resting upon? Is it resting upon God consciousness, or is it resting upon one's ego? And this is what we want to kind of glean from this, is that when we orient ourselves to God consciousness, as Malcolm X began to do, that we'll start to see that everything that we do contributes to and benefits us in our faith as well as in the world around. And so, eventually Malcolm X begins to find his own voice. He was not only the one who was preached, but he became a preacher. He became the one who was the minister. He didn't just receive those letters. He was now someone who was writing these letters. And it's, once he had gotten out of prison, he became a minister for the Nation of Islam. And one really interesting event happened in his life, which I think is really telling for each of us, that one of the places and events that he was invited to was the Harvard Law School Forum. So again, remember that Malcolm X was someone who did not have a high school, a graduate, or a traditional, ministry education or seminary education. Malcolm X had his education behind bars, and he never had any kind of a GED or any kind of equivalency there. So this was a man without a degree or without an education per se, the traditional education, where he's invited to the Harvard Law School Forum, and he tells that he recalls looking outside of a window, and he realizes that when he's looking outside of this window, he was looking in the direction of the apartment house that was his old burglary gang's hideout. And Malcolm writes that it rocked me like a tidal wave. Scenes from my once depraved life lashed through my mind, that I was living like an animal, I was thinking like an animal. Awareness came surging up in me that how deeply the religion of Islam had reached down into the mud to lift me up, to save me from being what I inevitably would have been, a dead criminal in a grave, still alive, a flint, hard, bitter 37-year-old convict in some penitentiary. That Allah had blessed me to learn about the religion of Islam, which had enabled me to lift myself up from the muck and the mire of this rotting world. And there I stood at that Harvard window. I silently vowed to Allah that I would never forget that any wings that I wore had been put on by the religion of Islam. So again, tying this back to us, not only Malcolm was at that moment where he is standing in one of the most prestigious universities in the country, in the world, and is looking out of this window, sees what his life would have been, what it was, and where he is now, and attributes it to his faith. And a lot of times this is a huge disconnect for us in this world and in this society, where it's hard to attribute what we can to our faith, because we see our faith as that which happens on the prayer mat. We see our faith as that which just happens on Fridays in the masjid, as that which is just when our parents yell at us for not doing something right, or the imam may have has some strong words for us if we choose to dress a certain way or whatnot. That that might just be our faith, and so the world outside just becomes whatever it is. But we see this powerful intersection where Malcolm sees where he was, sees what he was doing, but sees not just like, hey, one day I just got it, like, I fixed myself or whatnot, but attributes it to his faith as pulling him out of the mud and giving him the wings that he had. Any attribution that he had to being able to be lifted up was to his faith. And so to reminding himself that wherever he was, his faith had played an integral role of changing his whole life's trajectory. And later on, 12 years after he had converted, he went on his journey, his pilgrimage to Mecca for the Hajj. And it's really telling, because we oftentimes think of ourselves in a society that age is something that is the biggest limiting factor, that if you haven't learned to do something by a certain age, you are automatically a failure, or you are behind in some certain level. So if you haven't read the Quran by the time that you are a kid of puberty, that you have failed. That if you haven't memorized the Quran, if you haven't learned recitation, if you haven't done all these basic things, if you haven't gotten married by a certain age, if you haven't done all these things, we're sometimes attributing how people are failures if they don't do these things, if they don't meet this mark. And it's really interesting, because Malcolm X, when he went to Hajj, he wrote in his autobiography that in my 39 years on earth, again, 39 years, he'd lived a fairly full life, 39 years on this earth, the holy city of Mecca had been the first time that I had ever stood before the creator of Allah, the creator of all, and felt like a complete human being. That almost 40 years old, he had this epiphany that at this moment, I realized, like, kind of who I am, that I feel complete in that sense. And sometimes we feel that if we haven't gotten our faith right by the time we've hit puberty, by the time we're in college, by the time we're out of college, by the time we're married, we have kids, all this stuff, we relate back not just to Malcolm X, but to all the Sahaba and the Sahabiyat who embraced Islam at various points in their life, as old as 70, 80, as young as kids. And so, you have, it's all relative. But to see that at this moment, when we see Malcolm X as a source of inspiration, that for 39 years, he was searching for that completeness. And finally, at that point, an intersection of his faith and his journey, he found that completeness. And so getting right, as Malcolm X had later put it, that getting right was not the only or the most difficult challenge for Malcolm on his faith journey, that getting right in a sense of leaving certain substances, leaving certain habits, and changing those, that even after he became a Muslim, though, he had a spiritual crisis. He had his own deep spiritual crisis, that he became a Muslim. He didn't just become a Muslim. He was the person preaching from the pulpit. He was the spokesperson for the Nation of Islam. And he himself encountered a deep spiritual crisis with the leadership of the Nation of Islam that culminated in him leaving the only Muslim community that he knew, which was there for him from the beginning, which was there to help him get out of prison, his contact to the outside world. And so thinking about this journey that Malcolm X, had this huge revelation wherever he was in life, when he was imprisoned, he starts to learn Islam. He becomes passionate about Islam. He becomes a spokesperson for this movement. He does all these things. And then, in the blink of an eye, essentially, his faith it collides, and it has a spiritual crisis to where the people who he trusted the most, the institutions he trusted the most, turned him out in a sense. And so he was left without a community after being at the top of that community. And so, then Malcolm later says that I do not pretend to be a divine man, but I do believe in divine guidance, divine power, and in the fulfillment of divine prophecy. I'm not educated, nor am I an expert in any field, but I am sincere and sincerity is my credentials. And so thinking about that, you know, what kept him at that moment where so many people would leave their faith, so many people have left their faith when the system that is at play, when the leadership outs them, when they have a tumultuous relationship, or they have a spiritual crisis that is brought on by the transgressions of a leader, or by the abuse perpetuated by a leader, or by an institution that just outs them, that people leave the faith wholesale. And you know, it's absolutely not something for me to say that that's wrong, or that's the way things should be, but just to think about how did Malcolm, as someone who didn't have an Islamic upbringing, didn't have that education, didn't have all this stuff, still cling on to his faith despite all of these this apparatus of his faith being locked down. And the one thing that he lifts up is his sincerity, that it's his character. And the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings of Allah be upon him, lifted up that the most perfect believer is not the one who prays razor sharp with respect to their hands and their postures, is not the one who is the best of people in certain aspects of ritual, but is the person with the best character, the person who has the best morals, the best etiquette. That is the most perfect believer in the eyes of Allah. And so for Malcolm, lifting up that my sincerity is the only thing I have to stand on, that my sincerity is the only thing that I will have as an inheritance. It'll be the only thing I can stand on, to see that was foundational to his faith. So when we think about our Islam, we know many people in our lives who may know the religion of Islam really well, who may know the faith of Islam very well, who may be acknowledged as these are the people who know their Islam, but they may be very terrible human beings. They may be people who we don't feel comfortable around, don't feel very safe around. And so it tells you that just having the faith knowledge, just having all that does not just mean you'll be a good person, but you have to have some inner qualities as well. And for Malcolm X, that was his sincerity. And for each of us, thinking about, even though we may not be the most perfect Muslims that we can be, or we compare ourselves to other people, what is the inner thing that we have? What are our credentials? Our credentials, are they just the acronyms that we put at the end of our name once we get a diploma, with that we're, so-and-so MD, so-and-so JD, so-and-so MBA or whatnot? Or are our credentials something more innate? Are our credentials something that can't just be bought? Our credentials are something that we work on and that we purify. And so when Malcolm X went to Hajj in pursuit of spiritual peace and connection, he described himself in that time that when he's rediscovering his faith, he's taken this leap of faith to go to a foreign land. He goes to this place that he describes himself as a stranger, that as someone who had been at the pulpit of so many Muslim gatherings, that at that point, after he had been removed from his community, he had left, basically this space, maybe not officially in a sense, but had kind of been outed in this aspect, that he was experiencing and described what it was to be voiceless, vulnerable, and at the mercy of the Almighty. He said that, because he's in a land where they don't speak English, that he's there on his own, that never before in my life had I felt so deaf and dumb as to the times when no interpreter was with me to tell me that what was being said around me, or what was being said about me, or even to me, that I was deaf, dumb, and blind all over again, but it was needed, that it was something I needed. And isolation in this time allowed Malcolm X to cancel out the noise of this world, to examine his faith, his relationship with God in that space of serenity and clarity, that even though he was probably in one of the busiest and loudest parts of the world, many people know how the neighborhoods and the market streets of the Arab world are. It's hard to get any peace and quiet. But when in that space, Malcolm X, because he couldn't understand what was happening, that he got that time to really process his own spiritual journey and his own connection to his faith, that he had now, basically for all purposes had been out of this, his what he knew as his community, what he knew as his faith tradition and his faith structure, that now it brings up that as he went on his own journey, he started to rediscover that. So the faith of Malcolm X, or Al-Hajj Malik al-Shabazz, can teach us many things. It tells us that at times our faith can and does take many forms, that our faith can move swiftly to the edge, but it can also find centering, that it may be at certain times we feel like we're at the absolute polars of our faith. We might be thriving in it, we may be in a pit of darkness, but there is still a centering that can be found. It shows us that even Satan, that's Shaitan, as Malcolm X called himself, can be redeemed when all other people think that he's lost, when all other people say for all purposes, you are lost. And it shows us that faith ought to be wedded to righteousness. It ought to be wedded into those things that you can't buy, into those things that you have to truly work on, rather than into the material things. That faith is just tied to how much education I receive. Faith is just tied to how great, how good my income is, or how well I'm doing in this world. That faith is tied to something on the inside. And it showed us that our faith can be shaped in ways as bold and as unanticipated as the faith of Malcolm X was. And in Malcolm X and through Malcolm X, in this example, and not just in Malcolm X, but I would argue for those other people who are behind bars, for those other people in our masjid who are at the back, for people who we may, disregard because they don't seem as outwardly Muslim as someone who has a kufi and has a jubba or like a toba and all these other things and has a nice recitation does. That in these other people and the people on the margins, we can imagine a world of possibilities for ourselves here and now. We can find Allah at work in our lives. We can find Allah at work beyond just the traditional rituals, and in a way that meets us where we are. Malcolm X lifted up that the hardest test he had ever faced in his life, thinking about it, the hardest test he had ever faced in his life was praying. That consider the challenges that Malcolm X faced in his life, with respect to what he suffered and experienced. His father was killed at an early age while he was a child. He became, a dope peddler, he became a burglar. He spent time in prison. He got outed by his community. He was all these different things. And he singled out prayer, the connection to Allah, as the most difficult thing is all. And he spoke these words when he was incarcerated and when he was descended into the lowest of the low. He spoke these when he called himself Satan, that his mind was reeling from the possibility of change, but his body was yet to commit, that I can't bend my knees, I can't do these basic things. And, for Malcolm X, the path of faith was integral to the path of prayer. And it required more than just a mental shift. He said that I had to force myself to bend my knees. Faith asks us to commit all that we are so that we might be transformed by Allah. We can't just say nominally that, oh, hey, I'm just doing this, like I'm a Muslim, so I just pray, or I just recite certain things, or I just do certain things. That it is, you are in there, both feet in, and up until you're to the utmost of your capacity. And so Malcolm's life after this first prayer, with all of the turbulent twists and turns, was lived and bowed before Allah, submitted and transformed. And you see that as we can navigate from this in the closing of this khutbah, that as we can kind of glean from this, is that when we go through our faith journey, wherever we might be in life, we want to be able to try and aspire to go both feet in. We want to be able to go not just heart, but heart and mind, not just heart and mind, but heart, mind, and body. That until we submit ourselves fully in this aspect, as Malcolm X did, we won't experience that holistic transformation. In certain ways we will, but we'll always feel that incompleteness. And for Malcolm X, it wasn't any matter of time, but it took him almost 40 years to get to a point where he said, I feel like a complete human being. I'm standing before the Kaaba. I feel like I finally am at that space, but it was still hard for him to pray. It's still hard for him to bend his knees. He didn't know the Arabic language. He didn't know any of these basic things. Yet Malcolm X is of the foremost Islamic figures in American history that people, scholars look up to and say, how did this person, just his story come about? What was his theology? What was all this different things? That you had a dope peddler essentially from Michigan come about and become somebody who changed not just the theological landscape of America, but changed how we understand faith to be practiced. That he was a modern day, Muslim that came in the path of the Prophet Muhammad SAW and taught us so many different lessons. So what we do in closing here is we want to sit back just for a moment and we want to reflect. We want to think about that. How many Malcolm X's are there in our world? How many of them may be in this audience? How many of them may be in ourselves? That we are on different paths. We may be born Muslim. We may have left Islam. We may be at a point of contention with Islam. But we are at that point where we may be considering ourselves that we're not worthy of faith, that we might be Satan. We might be a follower of Satan. We may say that we're like the worst thing. We're not worthy of all this stuff, or, hey, I'm just a bad Muslim or whatnot. Wherever we might be, recognize that that's not the end of our journey. That's not the terminal point, just like it wasn't for Malcolm. For Malcolm, acknowledging that he is I am Satan. I am like the antithesis of faith was the beginning of his faith. And for many of us, even if we were born into the faith and we arrive at that place, that doesn't have to be the terminal point for us. What is that? That can be our beginning point, that we arrive to this bottom space, but it goes up from here. And how do we do that? As I mentioned, it's not just by just acquiring all this worldly knowledge. For Malcolm X, it was that I don't have an education, even though he was somebody who became educated on the inside. He became someone who would go to Oxford, to Harvard, to give lectures and debates and be at the equivalent with people who have their PhDs, who spent their life, committed to academia and knowledge. And for Malcolm, it was just some prison books and being able to go through. But what underlied that was his sincerity, that my sincerity is my currency, that my sincerity is what I have to stand on. And that's the least that we can do. So as we go forth from here, inshallah, we ask Allah to not only make us people of make us Muslims in our hearts, but to make us people of conviction, to make us people of sincerity, that we are allowed, regardless of where we might be, whether we're kids, whether we're adults, whether we're elderly, whether we're young, that rich or poor, to allow us to have the ability to turn and change our hearts like Malcolm, to walk in the footsteps of Malcolm, and through the example of Malcolm, that wherever we might be, we know that however low we might go, that's never too late to come back to Allah. So as we depart today, remember that there are brothers, there are sisters who are incarcerated behind bars, who may be in walking in this path, and they have much to teach us as well, and we have much to learn from them. But think about, as we leave today, what are the prisons that we've built for ourselves in our mind? How has our faith maybe become a prison to us, and how can we unlock that? And starting the work first with, how do we change our own hearts? How do we change our own transform ourselves here before we go out and try and change all that we can that's on the outside? Thinking about, what is our currency? What do we stand on? And as Malcolm X did, that when he stood on his sincerity, he was able to get through the various challenges that his faith put him through, whether his community leaving him, or whether his theology changing, or whether him going to a foreign land, that his sincerity is what held him grounded into all these turbulent twists and turns. And what do we stand on, that if we go through similar things, that our faith falls apart? So thinking about the foundation that we build, and we ask Allah to, as our father Ibrahim had prayed to when raising the foundations of the Kaaba, to lift up that Rabbana taqabbal minna innaka antas samiul alim, that our Lord, accept this from us, accept whatever that we offer. Indeed, you are the all-hearing, the all-knowing. Inshallah, we conclude just with a few du'as here. Rabbana waj'alna muslimaini laka wa min dhurriyyatina ummatan muslimatan laka wa arina manasikana wa tub alayna innaka antat tawwabur rahim. Our Lord, make us Muslims in submission to you, and from our descendants make a nation that submits to you wholly, and show us our rights of worship and accept our repentance. And indeed, you are the accepting of repentance, the merciful. Rabbana atina fid dunya hasanatan wa fil akhirati hasanatan wa qina adhaban nar. Our Lord, forgive us and give us in this world that which is good, and in the hereafter that which is good, and protect us from the punishment of the fire. Rabbana afrigh alayna sabran wa thabbit aqdamana wansurna ala al-qawmi al-kafirin. That our Lord, pour upon us patience and plant firmly our feet, and give us victory over those who oppose you. Inshallah, I pray that you have a blessed Jummah, and remember that if you haven't encountered the story of Malcolm, it's always available. It's very prevalent anywhere you go. Half price books, Barnes and Noble, any place like that will have it. But just know that your faith can be inspired by all that is around you, and including yourself. And just the struggle of faith is not the end of it. It is maybe the beginning. So inshallah, aqulu qawli hadha wa astaghfirullah li wa lakum wa lisa'il muslimin. Jazakallah khair.